Our friend Jim Samples is back. Hello, Aesop. Good to see you again. It's good talking to you a little while ago. Um, how are we doing on time? Boy, time flies. I'll do two more maybe. Um, Jim Samples writes, Mueller, Comey, and Rosenstein have been three amigos since the Bush era, Mueller and Rosenstein since the early 1990s. It's now being postulated that the three of them hatched a plan to go after Trump by having Comey admit he used an outside source to leak to the press. They are pros at what they do, and they know how to trigger a call for special prosecutor. And since Jeff Sessions had already recused himself, this meant that Rosenstein would be the man to name the special prosecutor, his longtime friend Mueller. Which begs the question, did part of the Democratic Congress know of this plan, and that's why they insisted on asking Sessions if he would recuse himself? As we now know, Mueller then loaded his special team with Hillary supporters and donors. Question, do you think that they're going to continue to get away with this kind of corruption? I think we already know that Democrats won't care as long as they unseat Trump. I think all of this is not only plausible but likely. These are not conspiracy theories that, in the sense, look, the pejorative expression of a conspiracy theory to me is a theory that requires a far more complex explanation than what seems to be true. If it turns out that there are things in the existing story that simply cannot be explained, then this alternate theory might be worth looking at. I'll come to an example of that in a minute. So yes, I think this is not only possible, but likely. I tend to want to say that every time I see something that looks like massive control on the part of a few individuals, I tend to find that experience is basically shown me that the world is not that simple, that random factors are too big. The classic statement for this is never ascribe to, never ascribe to malice what can be explained by simple stupidity. And that's really it. The chips fall where the chips fall, and then, so on. But in any event, it's not unreasonable to me that these people have done that. Jim Comey, who I respected when I first heard his name, he's Judge Ito. He's a publicity lunatic. He's deranged. The bigger issue is, why is Trump sitting still for this? He doesn't. The whole purpose of electing Trump was that it seemed to be a guy who just didn't care what people thought about him. So I would have gone. If I was Trump, I would have gone after the corruption in the Department of Justice, and I would have done it vocally. I would have been Donald Trump as I could be. I would have reminded people about crooked Hillary, and I would talk about crooked Comey, and I would talk about the 8 years of or longer of corruption of the Justice Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the NSA and all the rest of it, and I would simply stay on it. And if I had an attorney general who didn't want to prosecute this, who didn't want to get into it and clean the whole thing out, then I would fire him publicly and I would humiliate him, and I'd find somebody who was willing to go ahead and do that. So he's not doing it. So it's, this first year, I've not been impressed. Been beyond disappointed. I'm absolutely, completely enraged at the Republican establishment. But that's not a surprise for me. I thought that Donald Trump would be putting up more of a fight than he seems to be putting up right now. And that's disturbing because he comes at a high price, Donald Trump. I mean, he's an extremely divisive figure. And I'll still come back to the day I die of anything other than Hillary Clinton. I mean, Hillary Clinton was not just a politician I didn't like. She was the end of the political system in terms of corruption and so on. So anyway, as far as that goes, I think you're right, and I don't know why Donald Trump is not swinging the big stick and realizing that this is he's either going to be him or them, and he's either going to be on the attack all the time, or if he's not on attack all the time, he's going to lose. That's how he got the job. It's by attacking all the time, and now seems to be strangely inert. Speaking of conspiracy theories, I think I'll probably just close with this, to be honest with you. This will take a few minutes. It's interesting to me to watch the internal mechanisms of what I'm about to tell you. So some of you will be up on this, some of you not so much. But there is a compelling case to be made that the works of William Shakespeare were actually written by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And I saw a documentary about this called Last Will and Testament, I think. And then I had seen earlier, and then I resaw with Natasha this film Anonymous, which is a dramatic story about the works of Shakespeare being written by Edward de Vere, and Shakespeare essentially being a front, because Edward de Vere was one of the highest-ranking nobles, if not the highest-ranking nobleman during the Elizabethan era, and lots of heads were chopped off during those times, and so on and so on and so on. And I bought this hard. I was so what made me go off into the weeds about this? Because this is clearly a conspiracy theory, and it's more complex than the simple story that William Shakespeare wrote them. Obviously, he was credited with them the whole time, and so on. This theory is called the Oxfordian theory, by the way, because it's the Earl of Oxford. But there were things about the traditional William Shakespeare story that struck me as so odd and so unbelievable that it begged for a better explanation. Now, I'll just give you a couple of the ones that I found the most compelling. This was not so much that I liked the case for de Vere, although he filled the gaps pretty nicely. I had and I continue to have serious questions about the actual Shakespeare story. And the reason I'm telling you all this simply, how do you weigh evidence? How do you weigh evidence? How do you come to some kind of appreciation of the truth and so on? So we got this 400 or 500 year story of William of Stratford, who's written the plays, and everybody knows it, and we talk about the Shakespearean plays and all the rest of it, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, and that makes sense. Why would you jump the rails, get off of this, and start, getting into what traditional scholars to consider to be a classic conspiracy theory that is simply a waste of time? And by the way, I'm not going to conclude with the case for de Vere. I'm just telling you how I got to where I am, because it was interesting to watch from the inside. But there were some things about the Shakespearean story that I think are profoundly problematic. There are 6 surviving examples of William Shakespeare's signature on legal documents, and no 2 of them look alike, no 2 of them are spelled the same way, and they are written in a hand that is so primitive that it is simply absolutely not possible that the person that signed William Shakespeare to those legal documents wrote those plays by hand on parchment. It's just not possible. I do not believe it. The person can barely form letters. It's not like he dictated this. It's not like he dictated it or had it typed. All of the stuff that was written in those days was written in your hand on parchment with an inkwell, and the 6 surviving signatures of William Shakespeare are not the signatures of a man who writes anything, let alone these works of literature. You don't have to have a fine handwriting to have written Hamlet. You don't have to have been a great penman to have written Hamlet. But if you write 27 plays or whatever it is, and 106 sonnets or whatever, your handwriting will be sufficient to at least be able to sign your name. And his is simply not. It's simply not there. It's not good enough. There are no works of Shakespeare that we're aware of written in William Shakespeare's own hand. That's That's an argument, but that's not a convincing argument. The signature is extremely powerful. Also very powerful, I think the second most powerful piece of evidence against William of Stratford was first the signatures, and secondly, he had 3 daughters, and all 3 of Shakespeare's daughters were illiterate. They had to sign documents with an X. That's a profound objection. And I'm not the first person to feel this. Mark Twain and I want to say Hemingway, Charlie Chaplin, a number of other people are convinced that this William of Stratford guy, based on the existing evidence, didn't do it. And what I find interesting is, again, I'm trying to just tell you about the procedure. Scholars of Shakespeare have no problem with this whatsoever. They think that the Oxfordians are absolute lunatics for a number of reasons, and I'll get to those objections in a second. The people that have an instinctive reaction to this are writers. Hemingway and Twain and Whittle, all of them, they all just simply can't believe it. This is not a writer's thing. Third piece of evidence that I find also extremely problematic is that at some point, I think in his 40s, William Shakespeare left London, returned to Stratford, and lived for a number of years. And during that time, he never wrote a single play, never wrote any letters that survived. That is unusual behavior for a writer, to simply stop. I mean, Stephen King's written many, many times more words than William Shakespeare, and he's not stopping. And I don't think I'm ever going to stop. I have no doubt the quality of my work will decline, but I'm not going to just stop. And this is why I think so many writers have problems with the Stratford story, because writers understand that this is not the signature of a person who's written things, that if you are the greatest writer, the greatest storyteller, let me rephrase this, if you have more mastery over the English language and the human condition than anyone before or since, you do not have 3 daughters who are illiterate. It's simply, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. So the Stratfordians come along and say, well, there was this guy who was Edward the 17th Earl of Stratford. And as a young man, he was extremely rich, given an extraordinary education, was tutored by any number of people. Stratford spent years in Italy. Turns out a third of all of Shakespeare's plays are set in Italy. And almost all of Shakespeare's plays are set at the court of various people. Hamlet is set in the court of the Danish royalty. And all of them are set at court. William of Stratford was a son of a, what was he? He wasn't a butcher, I think, but he was a commoner. And there's no evidence that he even got a grade school education, but they did show the grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, where they don't have proof that he went there, but of course they don't have proof that he didn't either, so that doesn't matter to me. That's not real evidence. But they're trying to make the case that this guy could have written these things from this little building, from an education based in this corner building, and it doesn't ring true. So they start making the case for Edward de Vere, who was noted as an extremely clever guy whose writings for the court and plays and things that have been produced in front of the court were superb. Some of the writing that I've seen that is supposed to belong to de Vere has a very Shakespearean feeling to it. And then I saw this movie Anonymous, where they went so far in the other direction with it. They made William Shakespeare, they made William of Stratford, they made him into a buffoon and actually kind of a thug and an idiot. And they posited that Stratford had an affair with Queen Elizabeth, and they even went on top of it to say he was actually an illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth. They went after all this stuff that just completely muddies the waters. And I thought, wow, that's it. I'm convinced. I'm convinced it's de Vere. Absolutely convinced it's de Vere. And then when I was surely convinced it was de Vere, This is why I think this is so interesting to me. It's why I find this very interesting to me. When I was utterly convinced that that it wasn't a hoax. It wasn't like Shakespeare stole this stuff. It's just Shakespeare was a name that De Vere used in order to publish the stories he wanted to tell at a time when, if he did that, he'd be put in prison or beheaded. That made sense to me. That was a plausible explanation for why he would write it anonymously. It overweighed the signature problem and the illiterate daughter problem and the retiring from writing problem and all of those things. It was more compelling to me. It had more weight. That evidence had more weight to me. And then I did something, and this is the part I think is most interesting. After I was utterly convinced it was Edward de Vere, I started looking at the case for it being William of Stratford. And I didn't want to do that. And that's the part I find fascinating. Because I'd gotten a hold of something that I liked and I believed was true and I thought was more interesting than the story I had. And I was utterly convinced of it based on the evidence that I'd been presented by the Oxfordians. It was a compelling case, extremely compelling case. In terms of the basics, in terms of forget all the, illicit affairs and so on. Extraordinarily well-educated young man who was known to be extremely literate, was tutored in so many different fields, and Shakespeare wrote about so many different fields. A young man who grew up in the court of Elizabeth, who was writing about previous dynasties and so on, and simply this just wasn't done. Even today, they didn't let actors into town in many cases. Their reputation was so low. So this was a compelling theory, and there was nothing magical about it. And then I started to read the case for William of Stratford. And the thing that's most interesting to me about the story, reason I'm telling you, is when I had an idea that I was liking very much, and I had a philosophical position that I had come to, and that I was simply in love with. I just loved the fact that this was something that seemed true. And that there was a big injustice done. But the 17th Earl of Oxford died in 1604, and Shakespeare's plays continued to be published after that point. They were published, I don't know if they were published right up until his death, but Shakespeare died in, I want to say, 1616, 1618, something like that. Now, that doesn't destroy the Oxford argument. The Oxford argument is he wrote them, and he gave them to William to be the front man for it, paid him for it. By the way, there's some conjecture that the reason that he chose William Shakespeare is that the name was such an excellent pun. Will Shakespeare. I will shake a spear. Will Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is hyphenated. There's all these little things. Shakespeare. It was the guy from Avon spelled his name Shakespeare with no E, and all the rest of it. So there's lots of circumstantial evidence, and all this stuff is either here nor there. Certainly not enough to overturn the William of Stratford thing. But then there was the signatures. And by the way, please look them up. I really would encourage you to do it. Just Google Shakespeare signatures, and you will see signatures that which certainly shocked me, and that was compelling evidence. So then you start reading the case against de Vere, and then that gets to be a compelling case. And I find myself saying, well, the case for de Vere that was presented by the Oxfordians is not nearly as strong as I thought it was. And does that mean that I go back to the simplest answer, which is Occam's razor, which I kind of live by? Ken Finney says he's written a number of books, and then the last one was 6 years ago. He hasn't written since. I agree, Ken. The fact that he didn't write after that is not in itself compelling evidence. The fact that he retired from being the most famous man to London back to Stratford and was a grain merchant is not compelling evidence that he didn't write the plays, but it doesn't feel right. That's not enough to make the argument on. Just look up Shakespeare's signatures and illiterate daughters and all the rest. And then the question becomes, could a man, really this is the whole issue. A lot of the criticism of the Oxfordians was basically it's a snobbery issue, that they couldn't, that especially British critics could not accept the fact that a commoner wrote these things, that it had to be some kind of an aristocrat. And I was sympathetic to that criticism. I thought, yeah, of course they want it to be an aristocrat. Of course they do. They can't handle the fact that it was just a regular guy just sat down and wrote this stuff. But even if you allow for the kind of genius that he clearly was, that the writer, whoever it was, even if you have to allow for the genius of the man, that's simply inarguable. The thing about Shakespeare is he got everybody right. He got inside the head of so many different people, and he captured the human condition, and he captured the human condition from so many different angles, and in terms and words that were just beyond well constructed and beautiful. They were, what's the word I'm looking for? They weren't just iconic. They were definitive. The suicide question, to be or not to be, that is the question. These issues are profound issues. And could a guy from a small town with a common education, no record of any higher education, certainly no tutoring or anything, never been abroad, never left London by most accounts, could somebody like that write with the degree of familiarity of law, medicine, and especially the interior of how courts worked? I don't think so. And I come back to these signatures. And then the question is, so here's the point. Look, I'm not trying to tell you I was a convinced Stratfordian for my whole life. Then I saw the arguments for De Vere. Then I became a convinced Oxfordian. And then so I just want to tell you where I am now, because I'm trying to do this the right way. I'm trying to assign weights to evidence. I don't have experimental evidence. I don't have conclusive proof either way. If it turned out that we had plays that were written in the same hand as the person that signed the legal documents, William Shakespeare, there would never be a conspiracy theory. This whole thing would be moot. But we don't. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But likewise, it's odd. Apparently, Shakespeare never wrote any kind of a tribute to Queen Elizabeth when she died, and all the other poets of the era did, and so on. And then there's all this secret messages stuff. I don't put much stock in that, although they do connect rather well. I think you can probably do that with anything. So where am I with this? Well, first of all, I don't think the fact that things were published after the death of De Vere does not necessarily mean that De Vere didn't write them. Some of Mark Twain's most vicious stuff was published after his death, specifically because he knew how inflammatory it was going to be. There are a number of instances in the case of the life of William De Vere that are repeated in a number of Shakespearean plays, and some of these things are a little odd and so on. The argument for Italy I find particularly compelling, okay, so here, see, this is a good question. Edward Blake has a comment that I think is a very good question. How could Tom Clancy have written The Hunt for Red October without access to top secret material? He clearly could have written The Hunt for Red October without access to top secret material, Eric, but he could not have written The Hunt for Red October if he had grown up in Kansas and never seen the ocean or read about the ocean. I know a fair amount. I could write The Hunt for Red October. In terms of my technological base, I could write a story with that degree of detail because I understand, I think, rather well weapons systems, strategy, deployments, all the rest of it. And I can tell a story. It's true I'm not in the Navy, and it's true that I'm not in the top levels of the intelligence community, but I could write that story, which makes the case for Stratford. But in order to make The Hunt for Red October, in order to write that novel, you have to know how submarines work. Not just how they work mechanically. You have to know what happens inside a submarine. When they come up with things like the caterpillar drive, you have to know about things like prop cavitation. If you don't know about prop cavitation, then the whole Red October story falls apart. It's not just a piece of chrome. So the question is, how does William of Stratford know that props cavitate? based on their depth and the number of RPMs they're doing. How does he know this? Where did he get this information? I have a pathway to where I got the information. So, yes, it's true that Tom Clancy was not a naval commander. It's true that he was not a submarine commander. It's true that he was not a CIA operative. But he read all about these things, and he had a large number of friends who were in those places who told him as much as they could tell him without violating their security clearance, as I have. I have friends like that. So I'm placed to be able to write a story like that in a way that Milo Yiannopoulos is not placed to write a story like that. Right? I mean, he's a famous guy and a creative guy and all the rest of it, but he doesn't have this information. And he's not likely to have acquired it. So I tend to come down on the side of the Oxfordians on this. I don't find anything in the Stratfordians, William Shakespeare of Stratford, Edward de Vere of Oxford. These are the two leading contenders. I think de Vere's the best candidate by far. So how do I weigh the evidence? I put a tremendous amount of weight on the one surviving piece of actual tangible evidence. This is not a speculation. It's not a story. Tangible evidence is signatures. And those are not the signatures of a writer. They're not the signatures of a literate person. This is hard evidence. It's not speculation, it's hard evidence. The signatures of Shakespeare's daughters are also hard evidence. I find that extremely compelling, that his 3 daughters couldn't read and write. Well, maybe they could read, they couldn't write. I just don't believe it. I don't believe it. And then everything else, down the line. The thing about retiring is not conclusive by any means. You're exactly right to point that out. But it does point. It's a data point that helps one side of the story and not others. So look, I don't know. It's possible that a guy who was never seen in the court of Queen Elizabeth, who certainly didn't grow up among the court, was without question not an insider of the court. It's entirely possible that that person was able to invent all of these scenarios. But I don't think it's as likely as a person who grew up in the court and had a profoundly good education for his time, including years spent in Italy and other things like that. This is the whole reason why I'm telling this story, because it's a great example of trying to find it's a great example of trying to figure out what's true when you have very little evidence and evidence is conflicting. How do you weigh evidence? How? The Loch Ness Monster for me is, I discovered this late in life because when I was younger, I thought there is a Loch Ness Monster, and I've seen the pictures of the plesiosaur, paddles underwater, and I've seen the doctor's picture and all the rest. But of course, there's a Loch Ness Monster. And then I realized, no, the photographic evidence is not compelling for the Loch Ness Monster. Probably not true. And then I realized, wait a minute, this is an air breather. It's going to be visible 10 times an hour. Of course there's no Loch Ness Monster. It's logically excluded. The Loch Ness Monster is eliminated by logic. It's simply impossible, that one. It's eliminated in a way that the 9/11 conspiracies are eliminated, and it's eliminated in the way that the moon landing conspiracies are eliminated. They are logically impossible. There are elements to those stories that are logically impossible. Therefore, that's not true. Strangely enough, Bigfoot and flying saucers are not excluded logically. I don't believe in either of them either, but they're not excluded in the way that the Loch Ness Monster is excluded, the 9/11 conspiracy is excluded, and the moon landing is excluded. A creature that has to come up for air is not photographed as a blurry outline once every 40 years. Whales are creatures that have to come up for air. We have lots of pictures of whales. Likewise, the moon landing is the idea that it was shot on a soundstage is excluded by the fact that if you look at the feet of the astronauts, forget about the lights and the angles and all the rest of this nonsense, and you can make out a letter C on a rock and all the rest of this garbage. You're trying to tell this giant story. The moon landing conspiracy is excluded in the simple evidence of watching any of the moon landings and watching the dust coming off the feet of the astronauts. The dust in the moon, on the moon sprays like water. It doesn't ride up in a cloud of dust. Dust comes off of the feet of these guys as if it was sprayed by water. That means it has to be in a vacuum, and to build a sound stage that is a perfect vacuum is harder than going to the moon. So, are UFOs, are aliens here on Earth in flying saucers? I find that profoundly unlikely. I find it so close to being unlikely that I consider it to be pretty much closed. No, they're not. But it's not excluded. And just because William Shakespeare has very shaky signatures, and just because his daughters are illiterate, and just because he didn't go to universities, and just because he didn't have tutors, does not exclude him logically. This is my point. William of Stratford is not excluded in the way that the Loch Ness Monster and the moon landing is excluded. And that's why I find this whole thing so interesting. I find that very interesting. And I think it's a good habit to have. I think it's the kind of thing you should be teaching young people, is how do you get to the bottom of this? I'm not at the bottom of this. If they were to come up with compelling evidence for why it absolutely could not have been Edward de Vere, 16th or 17th Earl of Oxford, then that would eliminate de Vere, but it wouldn't undo the problems with William of Stratford. We have surviving manuscripts of everybody else from that period. We don't have his. He's the most famous writer in London. We don't have his manuscripts. We've got excellent paintings of acquaintances of his. There's a couple of good. There's a top quality painting of Marlowe, Francis Bacon, Ben Jonson. In fact, one of the portraits of Ben Jonson, a contemporary of Shakespeare, is very much more realistic than almost anything in that period. The particular artist that painted Ben Jonson was a precursor to the Dutch masters, to the Van Goghs and so on. The picture of Ben Jonson is an extremely modern portrait. And all we really have of William of Stratford is that engraving that everybody's seen, which was done years after his death and is somewhat bizarre. There's a photograph. There's a painting that was once suspected to be William Shakespeare, was given as a possible portrait of William Shakespeare, and for hundreds of years was assumed to be a portrait of William Shakespeare, until the 1930s or 40s, when I think it was the Navy, U.S. Navy, figured out how to do infrared photography. And they took a look at this painting that they thought was of Shakespeare, and they found out that the painting had been overpainted to eliminate the hairline, that the original painting had a nobleman who had a relatively high forehead but had hair, and that an artist had come in and painted over the hair to give him that bald expression that everybody associates with Shakespeare because of that particular engraving. So, there it is. I'm going to get more in depth on the anti-de Vere argument. I'm going to look really deep into it was William of Stratford argument, and if there are things in there that explain all this, I just want an explanation, and I haven't gotten one. I've seen a lot of, that's ridiculous, don't be. One of the points that they make one of the points that the Oxfordians make about the Stratfordians, the people who think it was de Vere as opposed to William Shakespeare, is that if you look at the biographies of William Shakespeare, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them, you will see a lot of he must have, he might have, he probably at this time was likely, and so on. In other words, they are saying he must have picked up his knowledge of the court at this time. He must have, he likely did, perhaps he did, and so on. There's nothing conclusive. Anyway, I am not as sure of DeVere as I was a week ago, but nothing I've seen yet has been enough to disabuse me of my suspicions about the William of Stratford. And I am going to go ahead and read, it's next on my list, I think it's called The Case for Shakespeare. And if there are compelling explanations for the daughters and the signatures and all the rest of it, then I'm back to William of Stratford. That's a really interesting issue. A very interesting issue. Would be quite something if it were true. But another, the final note on this, and then this final note for the show on the same sort of thing is, it is really wake up call for me in a good way, but it was an electric shock for me to realize how convinced I was of DeVere, having heard only the DeVere side of the argument. That's the part that's illuminating. I read a book when I was much younger, probably around 28, 29, something like that, called Best Evidence. It was about the Kennedy assassination, and this guy spent 600 pages explaining that Kennedy was actually shot from the front, and that while his body was on Air Force One on the way back to Washington, a team of surgeons had basically created entrance wounds and so on. And this was based on a doctor making an off-the-cuff statement someplace. And it's this elaborate theory based on how reconstructing the wounds and all of this stuff and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. And then many years after that, I read a book called Case Closed. I've almost got his name. And the first thing out of this guy's mouth, I got to get his name. He deserves to get his name. And it's right on the tip of my tongue. Gerald Posner. So Gerald Posner wrote a book called Case Closed. And Posner's contention was that it was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. And this is what I'm looking for with Shakespeare, because I knew a fair amount about the Kennedy assassination. And I had been told one side of the story of the Kennedy assassination for quite a long time. And Gerald Posner wrote a book called Case Closed, and after reading it, I know this could sound obnoxious to people, but if you read Case Closed and you still believe that there were teams of assassins or something, then you want to believe it for emotional reasons, much like I want to believe the DeVere story. But Posner closes the case, because what Posner does is he takes all of the things that, see, this is where it's a nice symmetry, nice, interesting kind of a wrap. There are problems with the William of Stratford story. There were problems with the Lee Harvey Oswald single assassin with the Kennedy story. And what you find in Case Closed is the explanation for all of the things that seem to be eliminating Oswald as the sole shooter. In other words, perfect example here is many of the conspiracy theory Kennedy things say there had to have been a second shooter. I'll give you two of them. One of them is because of what became known as the magic bullet theory, which basically says if you line up the shot as it came out of, shot Governor Connally, and then it went through Connally and hit Kennedy. And the way it's portrayed in the JFK book, the only way that this bullet could have done it would have been for the bullet to go through Connally and then sidestep some distance, like a foot or two, change the angle, and then enter Kennedy that way. That's why it was called the magic bullet theory. And that theory is compelling, and it is something that needs to be addressed in the way that the signatures need to be addressed. Now, what Posner does is he says, okay, let's have a look. Let's have a look at the pictures and let's have a look at everything. And what he basically shows is that the back seat of that particular Lincoln was wider than a standard Lincoln, and that Connally or Kennedy, I forget which, was turned at such an angle that now all of a sudden the shot lines up completely. So basically what Posner did was he showed photographs of where these two people were at the time the actual shot took place, and he destroyed the magic bullet objection. He destroyed it. He destroyed the timing objection. Could he get off these shots in the right order? Well, it turns out that that there was an oak tree between Oswald and Kennedy, and that they thought that maybe the third shot missed or something. I don't really remember, but having hit the branch of the oak tree would have explained all of the other things. He just destroys it. It's all over. And the thing that's so interesting to me about the Posner thing, and this is the part that really fascinates me about blind spots. That's the reason why I'm going through this whole song and dance here. It's about intellectual blind spots. The thing that Posner starts with is probably 2/3 of his book is about Lee Harvey Oswald. And he points out that in Best Evidence, a book of 600 pages, there may be 2 pages about Lee Harvey Oswald. Once you understand Lee Harvey Oswald, you don't even have to have all the ballistics evidence. I mean, this guy was a disturbed individual, defected to the Soviet Union, wanted to stay, was not allowed to stay, tried to commit suicide in the Soviet Union, so Eisenhower was coming to visit, so the Soviets let him stay. He was a celebrity for a while. He was a little guy who was very insecure. He was very much an attention hound. His father was an alcoholic and all the rest of it. And for a few weeks or months, he gets transferred to, they move him to Odessa or something. He works in a TV factory. And he's a big star for a while. He's an American who's defected to Russia, and he's the center of attention, and he marries this Russian woman and stuff. And then this attention wears off, and he tries to get back to the United States. And this is a big struggle, which he eventually does. He returns to the United States with his wife, and he tells her during the entire jet ride over that when he gets off of the plane, there are going to be mobs of reporters waiting to interview him because he's the big American defector to the Soviet Union. Plane lands and there's nobody there. And this whole guy's entire life was a struggle to be recognized. He took a shot at Governor Walker, a General Walker, a right-wing politician, took a shot at him. Missed him, and he's holding the Communist Manifesto. I mean, he's out there handing out leaflets, hands off of Cuba. The guy was a time bomb waiting to happen, and then basically we never would have heard about him except for the fact that he had already gotten a job at the Texas School Book Depository way before John Kennedy's parade route was announced, and Lee Harvey Oswald, who's this born loser, wakes up one day, reads the newspaper, and finds out that the President of the United States is going to be passing 50 feet away from him, below below a window in the building he works at every day. You don't need any of this. And this is the point. Posner destroys the counter-arguments that seem so compelling. The other one is simple, too. It's kind of gory, but it's also simple. One of the things that the Kennedy conspiracy people keep saying is that when you look at the Zapruder film, Kennedy's head goes back. When if he'd been shot from the back, his head would go forward. And that sounds like compelling arguments. It's physics, right? You shot from behind, his head should go forward. Well, Posner basically says that there have been pictures of, he basically refers to some execution pictures of people lying down on the ground, they get shot in the back of the head and their head goes up. And as I said, this is a little bit gory, but they did the math, and he showed it with a watermelon and so on. Basically, what happens is if that bullet hits Kennedy from the back of the head. Sorry about this. This is just the way the story goes. He gets hit in the back of the head with a bullet. The force of all of his brain and matter coming out of his head is actually it's a more powerful force than the impact force. In other words, it's Newton's second law working the way it's supposed to work. But it's not intuitive that way. So, yeah, I'm convinced that it was Lee Harvey Oswald acting by himself. Now, if somebody can do that for me with William Shakespeare, if somebody can explain to me things like the signatures and explain to me all the rest of it, and also shoot down DeVere, then I'm a happy camper. I'm back to where I was. Yeah, and Eric Blake points out that Kennedy was wearing a back brace. He had injured his back during the PT-109 experience in World War II. He was in incredible back pain all the time. He might have been addicted to painkillers. That's speculation. Some pretty compelling speculation. He also had Addison's disease. In any event, I'm a third loss, sorry. So that's kind of what I try to do all the time with all this stuff is what's true, what's not, how do we know? And new evidence can come up that can turn things over. But Penn and Teller did this. David Big Booty says Penn and Teller did this with honeydews. One melon had a pink pillbox hat on it. That sounds a bit like Penn Jillette at work. The guys on Mythbusters conclusively destroyed the moon landing conspiracy. But I have not seen anybody destroy the William Shakespeare conspiracy. I have heard people say, well, no serious scholar takes this seriously. No, you would never get tenure, or you'd never even be hired at a university if you believed in Edward DeVere, which is evidence. But it's not exclusionary evidence. Anyway, enough of this nonsense. That's that. So that'll do it for